Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the Illinois Rural Development Council. My name is Ann Silvis. I'm with University of Illinois Extension, and I also serve on the board of directors for Rural Partners. Before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping details. So because we have so many people on the line, please mute your mic. And if you're having bandwidth problems, you can always stop your video. That usually helps, but you don't have to stop your video if it's okay. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat space, and we will get to those questions that you pose in the chat toward the end of Dr. Jackson's talk. If you're having difficulty with the audio or any kind of technical difficulty, post those questions in the chat and we'll do the best we can with providing some technical assistance. And this webinar will be recorded and it will be available later on our website. If you've registered for the webinar, you'll get an email from Nancy when that recording is ready. So now I'd like to introduce Laura Hep-Kessel, who will moderate today's session. Laura is the Director of Telehealth Services for Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, and she's also serving as chair of the Board of Directors for Rural Partners. So Laura, thanks for your leadership in Rural Partners and for co-sponsoring this webinar.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you to Extension for partnering with us on this. We really appreciate it and enjoy working together. Again, welcome, good afternoon. I want to tell you just a little bit about Rural Partners before we get started. Rural Partners is the state's Rural Development Council. We have a volunteer working board. We are membership driven. We try to offer different opportunities to our members throughout the year, including this webinar series. Focus on different topics each month and keep that in mind and join us when you're able. Could you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you stopped for just a second there, but you're good now. Yeah, I think if you turn off your video.
Okay. I just received an internet connection issue notification, so I want to make sure.
Yeah.
So again, thank you to Extension. If you want to learn more about Rural Partners, we will include the link in the chat to Rural Partners so you can check that out and consider becoming a member. As a reminder, before we get started, Rural Partners is a nonpartisan organization, and we simply bring relevant topics up for discussion in our webinar series. So keep that in mind during today's presentation. So our presenter today is my friend, Dr. John Jackson. Dr. Jackson's with the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois Carbondale, and he's been with SIU in many roles since, I believe, the late 60s. So we are thankful that Dr. Jackson's giving us his time this afternoon, and we always enjoy his presentation. So I'm going to ask him to go ahead and get started. Thanks, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Laura. It's always good to be with this group. I think this is my third presentation. I always enjoy them, and I'm going to save some time for questions and points to be made at the end, and I always get good questions and good points, so I look forward to that. We're going to talk about Joe Biden at 100 days. This is a great time to be talking about that subject. The White House is counting last night and today and tomorrow as 100 days in office, and so we're right there, and I compliment those who planned this about 4 or 5 months ago to have the foresight to look forward and see what the possibilities are. This marker of the 100 days has become symbolically and substantially important in marking just how the newly elected president is doing, what his prospects are for a successful first term. I'm sure all of you know the term comes from Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression and the challenges the crisis of the Depression had brought to him when he entered the office in 1933. He took office with a crisis on his hands, but also a plan. And he announced in the very first of his term that he had a boatload of new policies and programs that he wanted to put into place in order to deal with this extraordinary economic crisis that the nation was facing in 1933. This plan became the New Deal that we're all familiar with, and the New Deal completely changed the direction and certainly the scope of American government. In the first 100 days, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats who controlled the Congress at that time passed 15 major bills that they thought would deal with the Depression. This includes that alphabet soup of agencies like the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the CCC, the WPA, the REA, the TVA, and on the list goes. Then in June of 1933, Roosevelt gave an address to the nation saying what he thought he had gotten done and how he thought he had already made some progress on dealing with the challenges of the Depression. I thought about that symbolism last night when President Biden was making his speech, doing exactly the same thing that FDR did back there in June of 33. And ever since Franklin Roosevelt, all presidents have had to work under the onus and under the burden of having to do something fairly dramatic in the first 100 days to give an idea of where they thought the nation should be going. Even before Joe Biden won the presidential election, and if I could get the second slide put up at this point, he turned to the challenges that he faced in trying to govern in this very diverse and deeply polarized nation. The divisions and polarizations were there already, but they had made worse, not better, by the 2020 campaign and the election. The ideal is that we have an election, it gets gone, and somebody takes office, and that somebody at least has an opportunity to govern. But the events on Capitol Hill of January the 6th, when the Congress met to certify the national results of the election, which had already been certified by the 50 states, led to all kinds of things we relate to with the term an insurrection. And then, of course, came the impeachment vote and the trial in the Senate. And those were just the final acts of the Trump administration. And that transition period really exacerbated the problems and the conflicts that had been a part of the Trump administration and even the polarization before that. What I think we don't recognize entirely is the fact that we have deep political polarization, but we've always had a constitutional foundation of separation of powers and checks and balances. And with separation of powers and checks and balances, the president's going to always have some challenges as to how much he can get done, particularly in terms of legislative and executive relationships. And they've gotten very, very much harder in the whole of the 21st century. So Biden knew he was faced with these profound challenges. He knew that he would have a challenge as to whether or not he could govern, particularly not in the executive area, but in those areas that require lawmaking and require a budget. So we had deep partisan polarization added on top of the checks and balances system. I'm sure you will remember the very large boost that Joe Biden and the Democrats got on December the 9th in that unusual Georgia runoff election where President Biden and the Democrats picked up 2 new Democratic senators. This gave the Democrats the most narrow possible margin with a net gain of 2, or with those 2 and a net gain of 3. That gave them the ability to just barely control the Senate with a 50-50 vote. And that kind of division in Senate's really fairly rare in American history. And that's what the president faced. And of course, that relies on the vice president to cast the deciding vote. But the first vote is the vote to organize the Senate. And Democrats were able to organize the Senate to take majority control of the Senate. And that's absolutely crucial. This made Chuck Schumer the majority leader and gave the Democrats the power over the committees and over the calendar and over the scheduling of votes on bills. And of course, Mitch McConnell then became the minority leader. There's no way to overstate how important that was to Biden's ability to govern, simply to get things done and to be seen by the public as in charge as having a plan and at least some possibilities of delivering on that plan. It's also crucial for his whole presidency and for the future of the Democratic Party. But keep in mind, he's facing the most narrow possible majority, not only in the Senate, but also in the House, where the division is only 10 votes. So bipartisanship or compromise? That's the question. And there is a plausible argument that can be made for both or either, depending on the circumstance in the bill. The Democrats, however, do have the option of going it alone if they think they're not going to get what they need in terms of compromise with the Republicans, or if they think the price that the Republicans are demanding, particularly in the South or in the Senate, is just more than they want to put up with. And that's exactly what happened on the COVID stimulus bill. Again, with that razor close majority in the Senate and only 10 votes to spare in the House, Joe Biden had unified government. He had what Franklin Roosevelt had, although he had a much more narrow margin than Franklin Roosevelt had. I think he has taken both Franklin Roosevelt in that period and Lyndon Johnson in 65, 66, where he had a majority in the House and Senate. That became the New Deal for Roosevelt and the Great Society for Johnson. And I think that's what Joe Biden aspires to. He is, after all, a veteran of 36 years in the US Senate, the longest term ever served in the US Senate by any American president. The only one even remotely comparable in terms of experience in the Senate or in the Congress as a whole, for that matter, was the case of Lyndon Johnson. But even Johnson didn't have that long a period in the Senate, even though he's called by Robert Caro the master of the Senate. Biden, a veteran of all of those wars, is undoubtedly aware of the historic precedents. I'm confident that Joe Biden wants to be LBJ, but without the war in Vietnam, and he wants to be Franklin Roosevelt without World War II. What he does not want, and it's pretty clear to me that is much on his mind, is he does not want to be Bill Clinton after the 1994 midterm elections. He doesn't even want to be Lyndon Johnson after the 1966 midterm elections. And he's painfully aware of the circumstance of Barack Obama after the 2010 election. So those midterm elections undoubtedly figure very, very heavily in the president and in his staff and in all the people that that work for him as they plan for what they're trying to get done. The question then became the 100 days and how to plan for it. He knows that the 117th Congress is the only time he's got to make that record because nothing is guaranteed after the 2022 elections. So if we could get slide number 3, please. Biden came in with priorities, he came in with plans, and he knew that he wanted to make this record, and he knew that that was a record that other Democrats would have to run on in 2022, and that he would have to run on in 2024. His priorities were to get the COVID pandemic under control and let the nation return to something like normal. And that's defined as before March 15th, 2020, when we basically closed down and the economy basically took a major hit. He knew he had to get the pandemic under control, but he also knew that he had to get the economy under control and opened back up, but opened back up safely. He put that in that order. That is, we had to get the virus under some control before the economy could really bounce back. So job number 1 was dealing with the virus in some measure of the things that he could control. He also wanted to get the schools back open and in-person learning back as soon as he could get that done. But he added the caveat that they had to be open in conditions that were safe for the students, the staff, and the teachers. And that proved to be a tall order. He first indicated that the schools could open back up in his 100 days. He then backed off and waffled a bit and said that would only apply to K through 8, and that 8 through 12, his ambition was that they would all be back in the fall at least. Biden, of course, most famously promised to get 100 million shots into the arms of Americans by the end of his 100 days, 100 million, 100 days. In December, when he announced this, the vaccine rollout was troubled, that we were very slow in getting those out. Trump administration had announced that they would have 20 million done by the end of December, but they came nowhere close to 20 million by then. But Biden nevertheless said he was going to do 100 million in 100 days. At first, the progress was painfully slow and disorganized, as we will all remember, but it began to pick up steam. The state governments and the local governments had to get involved, which they did. And I think you can conclude that governments were learning and that they did learn reasonably well. I think it's interesting to note on a more political and philosophical point that a lot of people say governments can't really learn, but I think you'd have to say that the rollout of the vaccine has been a learning experience, and one that most governments have risen to that challenge. On March the 12th, the CDC and the Johns Hopkins people announced that we had indeed reached the 100 million mark for at least one vaccination. The rate at that time on that day was about 2.2 million of vaccinations per day. And it was clear by then that they were going to meet and exceed Biden's original goal. And so Biden announced that the new goal would be 200 million Americans. On April the 18th, the CDC announced that more than 200 million shots had been given, and that 25% of Americans were fully vaccinated, and that 50% had at least one shot in the arm by then. So, turn to the economy, getting the economy stimulated and open again. And of course, it had to be done with some idea that the virus was under some decent amount of control. But the administration's first big legislative existence or legislative initiative was to get that $1.9 trillion COVID relief economic stimulus bill in place. The deadline was dictated to them by what had already been passed in the Trump days, because in March the 12th, the current unemployment insurance payments for millions of Americans were going to run out. So the administration and the Congress adopted the plan that they were going to get this done. The House passed it on February the 20th, and then the Senate passed it somewhat later. I think it's hard to overstate the importance of Biden winning that one. He needed that one in order to have a shot at even being credible in terms of the claim that he could set the agenda and that he could really deliver. It was a tougher slog in the Senate, of course, and it had to be that every Democrat voted for it, which they wound up doing, but Biden had to keep the Democratic coalition together. He realized that if he went smaller, he would lose the progressives like Senators Warren and Sanders and Booker. But if he insisted on that if he went smaller, he would lose the progressives. But if he went larger, he would lose the moderates. And so he stuck with what he initially said was going to be 1.9 trillion. And he did the same thing on the $15 minimum wage. He had that in, they had that in originally. But he realized there that he was losing Manchin and Sema from Arizona, and perhaps some others of the more moderate. He was very familiar with the Senate rules because of all the years he had served there. And I thought he handled the decision of the parliamentarian just about right, because she ruled that under the reconciliation rules, the White House, or that they could not add that. And at that point, the White House just sort of shrugged and moved on. They said, we'll deal with that later. Seems to me a more doctrinaire president might have gotten hung up on that, but this was Biden, the pragmatist, it seems to me. He'd take a half a loaf on that one and deal with it later, he said. Same thing happened on the targeted income qualification ceilings. They started out there with $120,000 a year to be eligible for the $1,400 checks. Pushback from some Democrats and all Republicans pushed that down to ultimately 80. So at that point, he agreed to compromise there too. So the next question is, what does that mean for the stimulus of the infrastructure bill that he is now trying to push? That provides for well over $2 trillion for roads, bridges, airports, repair of the electric grid, turning it into a truly national electric grid, green energy, mass transit, electric car recharging stations, new battery technology, R&D, and a host of other things, some of which are people-oriented, and some of which, of course, the people-oriented especially are the ones that the critics, especially the Republicans, are saying, how is that a part of infrastructure, and why is that in an infrastructure bill? But of course, the White House is arguing that you've got to have a human infrastructure as well. And the president talked a good deal about that last night. The number of social services covered is really extensive. There is support for 3- and 4-year-olds to have preschool. There is support for free tuition at community colleges. There's a long list of that kind of educational and really social support. This brings us to, if we could, slide number 4, and the question of the universal amount of opposition that the president is going to get from the Republicans. And especially this brings us to the filibuster. The filibuster is also closely tied up in the question of the Budget Reconciliation Act, because the two really now go together as questions as to whether or not a president can get anything done with either of them. The abandonment of the filibuster is very much in discussion right now, both in the Senate and otherwise. The only other option is then, if not, you can't get past the filibuster, you can use the Budget Reconciliation Act, but only under very special circumstances. Is it going to take 60 votes to pass any of this legislation? That's, of course, the rule for the filibuster. Or can we get by with 50 plus 1? The important thing to recognize about the filibuster is that it's simply a rule of the Senate. It's not found in the US Constitution. It's simply a rule that the Senate adopted mostly to placate the South, and it was used most of the time, in fact, the great majority of the time, up to the 70s and 80s, to keep civil rights bills down. And the South used it very effectively in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for example, for that exact purpose. Now it's much more widely used and routinely threatened. It used to be that you had to go stand on the floor and actually filibuster, that is, stand up and talk, and that put a physical limit on how much of a threat it was. Now all you've got to do is to file a bill or a motion that says you're going to have filibuster if this proceeds, and that's enough to stop it. And thus it has exploded in terms of the number of uses that it's had, both by the Democrats when they were trying to stop Republicans, and by the Republicans when they were trying to stop the Democrats. That means, of course, that We're going to have very, very important rulings out of the Senate parliamentarian again. She's apparently agreed to let this next one go because the rule, as I understand it, is that the bill's got to have a substantial impact on the federal government. But there's also limits on how many times you can use the Reconciliation Act. It appears that only 1 or 2 or 3 more times are even possible, at least for 1 year. So that brings us to the Republicans and their role in what Joe Biden's future is going to be, never mind the future of the Republican Party. If I could go to slide number 5, please. This, of course, goes back quickly to a review of the era of Donald Trump. The Republicans all rejoiced in 2016 when Trump won the Electoral College vote, and they got the White House, of course, as a prize for winning the Electoral College. But people don't really understand how important it is that with control of the White House, you actually control the massive executive branch of the federal government, and it is by far the biggest and most important branch of the American government. In 2016, the Republicans were delighted to take that Electoral College victory. They won the House and Senate almost as a bonus, and that gave them control that they'd had for unified government before then. Trump's appointment to the Supreme Court, Mitch McConnell's skillful management of federal judge appointment, and all of those lower appellate and district court levels allowed them to quickly take over the judicial branch. So at that point, they had unified government, which lasted until 2018. With this unified government, though, the Trump administration passed a massive tax cut in 2017. It was 1.9 trillion, which ironically is exactly what Joe Biden's stimulus bill was much later. This tax cut was something the establishment Republicans like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan had desperately wanted for years. They hadn't been able to get it in the Obama years, but here was Trump eager and ready to sign, and did sign that particular bill, which again is very much on the agenda again as to whether to roll back some of it, as the president talked about last night on the question of taxing. Later, they also passed a Criminal Justice Reform Act. That was really the only bipartisan bill of any consequence that passed. The tax cuts and criminal justice reforms were really the major legislative victories that Trump advocated for and got in his administration. I think part of the reason for that is his whole strategy was to play to the base. He kept the base energized and outraged and mobilized by his constant tweets and his attack on the opposition. And sometimes that opposition was in the Republican Party, really anybody that opposed him. His favorite public venue for these performances were the MAGA campaign style rallies, which he held all through the campaign, and then which he continued throughout his presidencies. The rallies accelerated in 2018 in the midterm elections. He barnstormed across the country, campaigned across the nation for candidates that were his candidates and that supported him, and occasionally for some state governors that supported him. In spite of all of Trump's successes and the campaigning that he did, the Republicans lost control of the House in 2018. Their worst nightmare came true. Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House again. The Republican candidates lost big time in the competitive districts. They especially lost in the suburban districts. They especially lost in the districts that were better educated, and among especially educated women voters, they lost big. So the critics started asking, what would that mean for both 2020 and the long-term possibilities of the Republican Party making good on their plans for winning 2020. 2018 results should have been a warning that campaigning and governing and running the country mostly centered on the base, as the president, in that case, President Trump was doing, might not be the best plan for 2020. The Republicans basically, however, decided they would back the president, not surprisingly. So he barreled ahead with the play to the base strategy for 2020. People who take an analytical approach, such as my colleagues in political science, however, pointed out going into the 2016 midterm elections that the Republicans had lost the popular vote for president 5 out of the last 6 times. This goes all the way back to 1992, when Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush. If you skip ahead to 2020, the Republicans have now lost 7 out of the last popular vote elections. They've won 2 electoral college votes, as I'm sure you know, in the original 2020 outcome or 2016 outcome. And then, of course, back with George W. Bush, beating Al Gore in 2000. But that's still not a great prospect for the future of the party when you lose 7 out of 8 popular votes going all the way back to 1992. The only election since 1992 the Republicans have won a majority vote in is George W. Bush beating John Kerry. This is 11, and I thought people generally thought that 2003, and presidents get what's called rally round the flag boost from having a new war on their hands, and that worked to President Bush's advantage in 2004. I would say also John Kerry, in my estimation, did not run a great campaign. All right, so the current battle is on for the future of the Republican Party, back past January of this year now. We've had a lot of Trump-centric recent drama. That drama continued through the transition, continued, of course, through December and its insurrection, and then the drama of the impeachment vote, which went on all through December. And all of that then basically raised the issue of what's Donald Trump's role in the party going to be in the future. The party is, I think, obviously fairly basically and fairly deeply divided over that. The question is, will it be Donald Trump's party, or will it will it follow his leadership, or will it move to some other leaders and some other voices? Most of the people on the establishment side seem to want it to move on. But Trump and his avid supporters insist that the Republican Party is now the Trump Party and that it must remain that, and that the establishment just has to deal with it. I think in the House, it's fairly notable that Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise have made their peace with that. McCarthy was off the reservation for about 1 week after he tried to talk to the president during the insurrection, literally inside the House and inside the Capitol on December the 6th. He said some fairly critical things about the president at that point and about how he had instigated much of this and how these were Trump's people, but that only lasted for 1 week. He then went down to Mar-a-Lago and made his peace with the former president and announced happily that the former president was going to campaign for congressional Republicans. The case in Mitch McConnell's is more complicated and not nearly so positive toward Trump, however. Again, I think McCarthy's made his peace with Trump. That's clearly not the case with Mitch McConnell. McConnell did vote against impeachment, but immediately after that, he made a fairly famous speech in which he said a lot of this was instigated by the president, that the president bears a lot of responsibility, and that it's time for us to own up to that. Later on, he sort of backed off that a little bit, but it's really not at all clear that Mitch McConnell is going to really have anything good to say about Trump in the future. And so the two leaders, House versus Senate, go fairly different ways in terms of their view of the former president's future role. The grassroots, the polls show, really want Trump by a fairly significant, usually about 2/3 margin. The grassroots Republican voters say that they will follow Trump and that Trump is the leader of the party. The big question now for all of that leadership and what might happen in 2022 is whether or not Trump will recruit candidates in those 2022 Republican primaries. He announced very early that he would go against and go after those who opposed him. He singled out, for example, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. He subsequently singled out John Thune, who is second in command under Mitch McConnell, for people who had basically voted against him or who had spoken against him, one or the other. And he announced that he would go to their states and campaign for somebody else in the Republican primary. He has specifically singled out Governor Kristi Noem, who is a new star in the Republican Party in South Dakota. And he said that he will run, if she will run, he will go up there and campaign against John Thune in the 2022 Republican primary. And he said the same thing about Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. And of course, he's not had good words for Liz Cheney, who's been really on the hot seat with the Republicans ever since she voted for impeachment. So that's the big hammer that Donald Trump has got. Does he make good on his promise to recruit and fund insurgent candidates against the 17 Republicans who voted for impeachment, 10 in the House and 7 in the Senate? Does he really wreak havoc in those Republican primaries? It looks like in a number of cases he's planning to do that. The more establishment voices include some of the more moderate Republican governors at the grassroots level out in the country. My native state is Arkansas. Some of you may have seen Asa Hutchinson, who is a favorite on PBS. He's often identified as a more moderate Republican. He has said very clearly that it's time for the party to move on. He's also not running again next time, however, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders is very likely to take his place. Republican Larry Hogan of Maryland has said exactly the same thing. So the battle lines are formed. It'll be very interesting to see it all play out in the months to come. We're not going to get any clarity on Donald Trump's role until after the 2022 midterm elections. And after that, we're going to be in the big conflict and the big muddle that leads up to the nomination for the Republican presidential candidates coming up on 2024. But keep in mind the 2022 elections, the midterm elections, are just 18 months away. And in this state, you have to file in December. So folks, whether you are tired of politics or not, we're about to get a lot more politics. Let me then shift gears a bit and go to number 6. Yes, thank you on the slide. I want to quote here a fairly famous political scientist by the name of Richard Neustadt. He has written the classic book on presidential power. In that book, he lays out the requirements for presidents to be able to govern, to get things done, to be successful, to pass legislation. It's hard to overstate the influence this book has had. It has, for an academic book, had an incredible reach into the corridors of power. John Kennedy, all the way down through Bill Clinton, at least among Democrats, claim to have read it and understood it. And it is influential in the thinking of presidents, no matter whether they know its source or not. In that book, Neustadt defined presidential power as preeminently being the power to persuade. That is, he pointed out that the president's really got to persuade others to support him and to help him achieve his goals. This is particularly obvious with respect to the Congress. He says you've got to use the president's power judiciously and wisely. You can't really just give orders, contrary to popular belief. People in the executive branch, much less people in the other two branches, are not going to necessarily just jump to and follow your orders or your wishes, as the president quickly learns. He says there are very few what he called self-executing orders that a president has at his control. He says that instead you've got to use the powers of the president to bargain, to compromise, to seek understanding from others. He's got to deal with those people who have power in their own realms. The president's got to recognize that he's got constituencies that he's got to woo. And I think that's particularly timely, again, in light of last night's speech. That's what President Biden was emphasizing last night. He was trying to persuade the people in the room there, and he was also trying to persuade the American people to go the way he wanted to go, to adopt his agenda. And that power to persuade was on display last night in the House chamber. Neustadt defined the constituencies that are most important as the Washington community, as he called it, and the national constituency, the public constituency. The Washington community is all the people in the Congress, the executive and judicial branches, all the other important people in Washington, the interest groups, the lobbyists, the media, the nonprofits. There's a long list of players, whether you like it or not, and whether you count them as the swamp or not, they are there and they are important in getting things done. But there is also the national constituency, the voters. There are, most importantly, the members of one's own party, but there's also the members who are independents and even the members of the opposition party. And this is the role of public opinion as epitomized in the polls. I'm going to cover the first one very briefly and then finish with the polling data. The Washington community, I think Biden has done fairly well on that. His strategy was to appoint veterans of previous Democratic administrations, especially the Obama administration, to his cabinet and to all of the key positions in the administration. There were a few new faces and a few faces from outside Washington, but not very many. Most of them were already well-known and well-respected people in Washington. And the same was true with his appointments to the cabinet. Most of them were well-known in Washington, and they were respected in Washington. I've read a number of articles about this since the cabinet and the lower level appointments have been made. And most of those articles analytically say that the overall image is he appointed people who respected the institutions, especially respected the agency that they were going to head, and understood and supported the mission of that agency. And that's not always been the case in the past. I think this really reflects Biden's own personality and his own operating approach. They called Obama no drama Obama, but Joe Biden's been, doesn't rhyme, but he's been no drama Joe Biden. And some have said he's even been boring, but I think the White House is taking the position that boring is a good thing. He's hoping to get things done, and he doesn't really create a lot of drama and a lot of conflict. So I think the Washington community, I'll quit with that on the Washington community, but let's move finally to the national polls. How's he doing? I would say overall that Biden got off to a reasonably good start. We measure that especially by job approval. The Pew Research people published a poll on January 15th, which was 5 days before Biden took office. And at that point, 64% expressed a positive opinion of Biden's conduct since he won the election. Now, again, think about that. That's the judgment on the whole question of how he had handled himself during the transition. Majorities also said they approved of Biden's cabinet selections and how he had been explaining his plans and policies for the future. The Gallup poll is, along with the Pew poll, but the Gallup poll is the oldest and the gold standard. It's the benchmark for job approval because they, believe it or not, have data that goes all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt in 1938. So it's a treasure trove of longitudinal data. On the day that Biden came into office, the average of his job approval rating was 57% to that point. The average of all US presidents from 1938 until now has been 53%. So Biden was up by 4. Not a huge difference, but a marginal difference above the average. Donald Trump's job approval for his whole term, and the rest of these are for whole term, was 42%. Obama's average for 8 years was 64%. George Bush average was 59%. Bill Clinton was 55%. George H.W. Bush was 63%. And maybe somewhat surprisingly to you, Ronald Reagan's average was 53%. So by that comparison, you'd have to say that Biden is right there in the average at about 56, 57. Gallup poll released more recently on March 18th. Biden was at 54, and his average at that point, halfway through March, was 56. I've got a whole bunch of data here on the race, gender, and place that you live, but let me just summarize quickly. Women are more likely to approve than men. Women 62% approve, men 49%. Race, white adults 45% approve, 52% disapprove. African Americans 89% approve, 8% disapprove. Hispanics 73% approve. Region matters. In the East, 61% approve. Midwest, 53% approve. The South, 50% approve, 45% disapprove. And in the West, 61% approve. Not surprisingly, in the rural areas, his approval rate is the lowest. In the cities, his approval rate is the highest. In terms of education, among college graduates, 64% approved, and 66% of adults under the age 30 said that the president was doing a good job, and 57% of those between the ages of 30 to 49% gave him a good review. So those are fairly well known and fairly expected kinds of outcomes if you do the specific crosstab kinds of outcomes. Finally, I think the polls show that Biden's specific policies are fairly popular. That, in fact, has been mostly a strength for him. On March the 11th, a CNN poll found that 61% supported what he had done on the COVID problem, and also approved of his relief bill and the stimulus package. Now, what's not to like, 90% of American households got a direct payment under it. So that's one consideration. Recent March Politico poll showed 72% of the public supported the stimulus, 69% of independents, and 44% of Republicans even supported it. On the new tax credit for children, which some advocates say is the most important way to get millions of families out of poverty, a whopping 85% said they approved in that Politico poll. So far, I'd say that overall, these results indicate that Biden is actually doing reasonably well, not gangbusters, but reasonably well in the verdict of the public opinion polls and in the public's view. I guess I would describe it as kind of a modest honeymoon, and it still seems to be holding up at the end of the 100 days. The divisions of opinion are clearly still there, particularly the disapproval and the lack of support for a lot of things that most Republicans give. But even this is slightly better than it had been in the past, for example, during the Obama era. So in conclusion, for the immediate future of the Democratic Party, their fate in 2022, I think it's heavily dependent on the record of the first 100 days. It's an important time. What does the Congress then do at the interim between the 100 days and the November 2022 election, which is really less than 18 months away? Likewise, the future of the Republican Party depends on how they deal with the Joe Biden initiatives. But more important than that is, how do they deal with Donald Trump? And what does that all mean as the run-up to the 2024 presidential elections begins? And it will be on us the day after the midterm elections, and sadly, in some ways, even before the midterm elections. So that's my pitch and analysis for now. I think we've got some time for questions and answers. So I will turn it over to folks who are going to referee the questions. Laura, that's you, isn't it?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jackson. Ann and I are going to tag team this. We really appreciate your time, and we always enjoy your presentation. And we've received some questions in the chat, and I received a lot of questions directly to me. So we're going to try to cover what we can. We do want to let folks know that I think Dr. Jackson's willing to stay on past the 1 o'clock hour. So we will try to get through them as quickly as we can, but we are also, I think, willing to stay on just a little bit late. Is that true, Dr. Jackson?
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay. Here's the first question, Dr. Jackson. What near-term and economic impacts do we anticipate from stimulus appropriations?
Well, it's huge. It couldn't be more important in many ways. I think it was 160 million Americans got a stimulus check. Down here where I live, the people who sell cars and furniture and all kinds of other things are taking out ads saying, we'll help you spend your stimulus money. And certainly consumer spending has really taken off, and consumer spending drives the American economy. And there's just no question but what it's a major impact. The morning news brought the fact that the economy was growing in the first quarter at 6.8, I think it was, 6 and a fraction. That's good news for Biden and good news for his promise that the economy is really on the mend and that jobs are coming back.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Let me go to a question that was asked earlier in the chat. Given what you mentioned about the Republican Party losing the popular vote in the last many elections, but still able to pull off a couple wins based on the Electoral College, have you had a chance yet to look at the new apportionment numbers based on the 2020 census and how changed numbers of state reps might change the Electoral College vote in the future?
Yes, and it's bad news for the Democrats and good news for the Republicans. There's no question, but what the states that are going to gain are the Sun Belt states, are predominantly Republican states, and Republican governors and legislators control them. The most extreme example is Texas, where they're really gerrymandered very heavily against the Democrats and very heavily in favor of the Republicans. And the states that are losing are predominantly Democratic, although not exclusively. West Virginia is an exception to that rule. So not good news for either the Electoral College vote in the future, or more importantly, immediately, the prospects for 2022 from the Democratic perspective, because the Republicans are going to benefit there too. And quickly, ironically enough, the states that are growing mostly because of increased immigrants and in-migration and increases in the cities where they're more likely to be Democrats. But with the power of gerrymandering and the power to draw the maps, it'll benefit the Republicans more than the Democrats in those states.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. What, in your opinion, is the chance of the filibuster to be removed?
Well, I thought the possibility got a good deal better on a more modest part of that recently, and that is Manchin, at least for a while, talked favorably about going back to the classic filibuster and what it required, which is to stand on the floor and, you know, Mr. Smith goes to Washington and all that drama. But that's a lot different kind of exercise than what's required now, which is basically no effort at all required. He hasn't said much about that lately, and he's become more aggressive in his defense of the filibuster. So that sort of in-between prospect seems to have maybe faded, but I'm reading some entrails of frogs there. That is Joe Manchin, and what will he do? I think the Democrats, if they had their coalition together, and particularly him on board, they would go for 50 votes. I think they are so fed up with the filibuster. But without Joe Manchin and without all 50 votes, they can't change that rule. So filibuster, fundamental change, problematic, I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Another question. Could folks such as the Lincoln Project people be able to reshape the Republican Party and perhaps peel off some more conservative Democrats who voted against Trump rather than for Biden?
Well, I think that's a possibility, and it's clearly what they want to do. They've had some internal problems of their own lately, but nevertheless, they are the sort of loyal opposition within the Republican Party, and they sort of represent the establishment. I think the acid test of that will be, how do these contested primaries go? It's a pretty serious thing to go into a primary and contest a sitting U.S. senator like Murkowski or Thune, for example. And it's going to be interesting to see whether or not Donald Trump and his supporters can knock off particularly those two high-profile Republican senators. Certainly, the Lincoln Project will try to help the incumbents there, but I'm not sure. We're going to have to wait and see on how that plays out.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. What, if any, are the chances that the Electoral College will be removed, do you think?
None in my lifetime or your lifetime, maybe sometime in the future, but the only way that would change would be if the Republicans and the small states started losing a series of elections. But keep in mind, every single loss since 1877 under those circumstances has been a Democratic loss and a Republican victory without exception. The only other one that even counts is 1824, and you can't count it because the parties didn't exist in their own form. But since the Republican Party came on board, every victory that depended on the Electoral College victory has been a Republican winning over a Democrat. So they're not going to change, and never mind the fact that it takes 38 states and 38 state legislatures, and there's no way we're going to get 38, not under the current circumstances.
So let me ask you a question that's a combination of a couple questions, but Kim just asked in the chat in a kind of a nicer way. Is there some way for rebalancing of influence in the Senate, as small states are now having an outsized impact on government? For example, the Supreme Court justices, legislating, et cetera. And the other question was, is there any traction to change the way Senate seats are allocated?
I think no and no are the answers there. I don't think there's any chance that's going to change. If the filibuster rule got changed, even if it went that baby step forward, it would dilute the option which the rural areas and the small states certainly have now to have way more influence and outsized influence in the Senate and in the Electoral College. But a determined minority almost always controls policy in this country. Now, the exception was clear. COVID-19 and the stimulus bill was an exception to that rule. If the president could get the infrastructure bill through, probably after a lot of negotiating and maybe some compromise with the Republicans, that would be another exception. But it's built into the structure of the Constitution and the structure of the Senate.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. The next question I'm going to kind of combine two. What are your thoughts on the Rust Belt and its needs politically? The past 8 years, the Rust Belt has seemed erratic in its political leanings, and it's hard to figure out why and what it really needs. Is it the needs of the region are changing, but where and how? And the same thing could be said of the Corn Belt.
Well, I don't think things are all bad for the Rust Belt, although we've certainly been losing too many House seats and Electoral College votes. But most Rust Belt states are also toss-up states. If you count Pennsylvania going forward across there to Ohio, to Wisconsin, over to Minnesota, those are states that are competitive, and competitive states do have some advantages. They get a lot of presidential attention during the campaigns and so forth. And we're going to continue to have those states as big states. Illinois gets less attention because we are a pretty reliably blue state. But that all being said, all of those things that you folks are interested in are absolutely critical to the future of Midwest and Rust states. We've got to find a way to revive and encourage the growth in these rural areas like where I live and where you're from. And that includes adequate health care. It includes adequate or better education. It includes things that are practical like high-speed internet. It includes amenities that young people want and go to cities for. And we've got to have an administration that understands that and that encourages the kinds of things that your organizations are all deeply committed to. It's absolutely essential in Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, all of the Midwestern states look alike on those needs and on having lost population because folks are not staying, young folks are not staying.
Dr. Jackson.
But let me add one other quick thought.
Yeah.
One I missed is college students. We've been losing, I used to be an administrator and worried about this all the time. We in New Jersey lose more high school graduates to colleges in other states than any other states in the union. And when I worried about this a long time ago now, that was true then, it's still true now. We've taken some steps recently to stop that. Last time I looked, we were losing 48% of high school graduates. Iowa comes and happily recruits in Illinois, particularly suburban Chicago, Indiana, you name it. I don't know if you saw, Tribune had an article about a year ago about how many Chicago suburban students were in school at the University of Alabama. Why on earth, I'm from Arkansas, but why on earth would you go to Alabama when you've got U of I sitting there and you've got SIU and all of that? It's because they're coming up here and offering them huge amounts of money and subsidies to get those good students. Anyway, I'll quit that.
You remarked that Republicans have lost the presidential popular vote for many elections, including the most recent elections. It seems to me, this is from Chris Merritt, that the most visible response by Republicans has not been to offer a different policy program. Instead, their strategy seems to be to try to limit the ability of people to vote. Is this an accurate perception? Is this good for democracy? What policy changes could the Republicans offer to regain the popular vote in presidential elections?
Well, I think in order, the answer is yes and then no. It seems to me to be what's happening. The ability to vote is absolutely essential, and the logistics of that ability are those practical things that all county clerks did across the country to let people vote more reasonably, longer periods, and all of that you know about. Early voting just really became critical and on display in 2020. And there is now a possibility in 42 states that will be curtailed. I don't happen to think the Georgia case is as bad as Democrats have tried to make it out to be, but some of the other states are as bad as the Democrats have tried to make it out to be in terms of the prospects for the Democrats and how it's targeted. And the no part of that answer is it's not good for democracy. The long-term trend's always been to grow the electorate, not suppress it and not try to contract it.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. What do you think the chances of seeing Puerto Rico and DC officially filing for statehood?
Not much better than my bad news negative idea that the Electoral College can be changed. I doubt seriously that we're going to see that happen. Both of them would be surefire Democratic wins, and I'm very skeptical that will happen.
Dr. Jackson, will the Republican Party follow Mitch McConnell's strategy of being the party of no and work to make Biden a one-term president?
That's a huge question. And there are signs on both sides of that, it seemed to me. They were that in terms of the COVID relief and economic stimulus package. No Republican votes, zero. Total party line vote. They're threatening to go that route with the infrastructure, but there is a conversation going on, and there is a chance that the Republicans will compromise on that and want to get part of the credit. So if it's ever going to happen, it's going to have to happen on the stimulus. Not much chance of the Republicans helping Biden on immigration, although that one's a crying need, no question about it. But I doubt that there will be a lot of Republican votes for any kind of immigration bill. On and on I could go. They've got to decide, though, if that's their strategy, which will really be the Mitch McConnell strategy in 2009 when he announced that the number one objective was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. and maybe that will change, but right now there are a few signs of it, but not a lot.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson, is there anything from the census data that you've seen so far that stood out? Anything from data regarding the US post-COVID-19 that stood out to you?
I think it was really a continuation of the trends that have been underway since the turn of the century. Maybe it accelerated just a bit. We've covered this, but the rural areas are still in big trouble in terms of their political clout, and that continued. We've got to have some kind of a strategy to get people to understand that the quality of life can be very, very good in rural areas, and the opportunities can be good, but it is a long, slow, and tough slog, as all of you folks know.
Here's a question that is a follow-up to the question about voting and limiting votes. Why is the idea of having an ID to vote considered limiting the ability to vote?
Well, that is a good case in point and an important question. The criticism is always that a government issued card with a picture on it and so forth falls disproportionately on the poor, the less mobile, I should say, minorities. It is getting to the point, though, that most people have either a driver's license or one of those state issued substitutes. And that's what I was referring to earlier. In all fairness to Georgia, that requirement is not all that restrictive in their new bill. And I don't think that's a place where those who are critical can make much of a stand, in my estimation. There are a lot of other places like shorter hours, fewer days, and not having the ability to take your own ballot in and turn it in. All of those are fair game. But in my opinion, that's not one of the big problems, nor is it a fair criticism by and large, it seems to me.
Thanks, Dr.
There's
Jackson.
pluses and minuses on Georgia, but that one is not a big deal the way Georgia's got that one rigged up.
Dr. Jackson, how do you think the removal of our military from Afghanistan and Iraq can affect current politics?
Well, I think it's going to be significantly positive for Biden. We've been there 20 years, and the polls consistently show that the American people, no matter what your ideology is, are totally fed up with that. And I think he's absolutely going to get credit for doing that. Now, Lindsey Graham's mad about it, and several other of the more hawkish people, but this is a case where those who are critical, I think, are out of step with public opinion, and Biden's going to get credit.
This one is a little off the topic of politics, but it's back to the idea of where people are moving, where they're voting. If there is a water shortage in the Southwest US, then can Midwestern states, which seem to have plenty of water, use this resource to our advantage to recruit people and employers?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think we should be doing that. We probably have made those kinds of points in things like recruitment of future industrial locations and so forth. But the Southwest and big parts of the South are drying up. And you can't just keep moving people to Arizona, across to New Mexico, across to much of Texas. I mean, it's just really remarkable how badly they're doing on drought. And if it's not the drought, it's the wildfires in the West Coast that are related. And we have an abundance, and we need to be using that advantage And there's no question, but it's a precious resource that we are well blessed with.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Ann, unless you have others, I think we're down to the last question. Do you see any possibilities in the next 40 years for redrawing state boundaries, Dr. Jackson? And real quick, I wanted to mention Nancy just posted the poll for folks to fill out while we're answering this last question.
Redrawing state boundaries. If that relates to should we be two states in Illinois as the most prominent and relevant example, I would say no, not going to happen. And I don't think there's another state where it's any more likely to happen than here. California is always up for grabs in terms of Northern California or Central California. None of that is practical. It won't get through the state legislatures, and if it did, it won't get through the Congress. The Congress is not going to start carving up states, and certainly Illinois is not about to be carved up, no matter how many people campaign on that. It's a symbolic politics, not a practical politics kind of movement.
Ann, do you have anything else before we kind of wrap up? So
I'm just kind of going back over the chat, and I think we captured everything on the chat. There was a lot there, so forgive us if we missed something. We tried to combine some of the questions, but I think we got everything. Thank you.
And Dr. Jackson, I don't think that you're seeing the comments right now, but someone said this was great. I could listen to Dr. Jackson all day long. We also have a graduate student that would like to be adopted as your granddaughter. So
thank you.
You've got some really nice compliments and different than maybe what you normally get. So thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. We really appreciate this. You taking the time. I think, like Ann said, I think we got through most of the questions. We hope we didn't miss any. Just want to let folks know that, again, this webinar was recorded, and Nancy will be posting this to the local government education website on Extension's website. And then she'll also send out an email with the link into the slides in the next, it's usually within the next couple of days. So you should get that if you're registered for the webinar. If not, I think you can put your email address in the chat box and she'll make sure you get that. Again, thanks to Extension for partnering with Rural Partners and offering these webinars and this one in particular. And we really appreciate you all being here and hope you have a great day.